Making history again here at MythVision Podcast. I got Dr. Dennis MacDonald and Dr. Richard C. Miller, and we're going into one evidence that mimesis is taking place in the Gospel of Mark, or just say the New Testament. Open your eyes and stay tuned. We're making history.
Thank you, Derek, and thank you, Richard. This is going to be fun. I have only one objective for our discussion today, and that is to give textbook example of mimesis in the New Testament that qualifies for all of the criteria for mimesis criticism. And I intend it to be the camel's nose under the tent, because once you grant that this kind of thing is happening in the New Testament, the other examples become more credible, even though I think this one is quite incredible and amazing. And I really value your responses to this work. The reason I take this example is that mimesis is an art as well as a science. And as with art, there's a great deal of subjectivity that's involved. Every week I get one proposal through the internet of somebody who's seen a parallel between the New Testament and Greek poetry. And almost always it's undisciplined. I credit with imagination, but not with reliability. And it's because there are no criteria, discipline the judgment. So I'm going to start by having us read the criteria for mimesis criticism, which is simply an attempt to make the art of literary imitation, spotting it and interpreting it, more reasonable and more defendable. And this one, I think, is perfectly defendable. And I don't know how people are going to squirm out of this. The New Testament authors are imitating Greek poetry, and they're doing so not because they're plagiarizing, but because they're involved in cultural engagement. And they're trying to show that their social identity can be carved out against the Greek identity in a sympathetic manner. So here are the criteria. The first one is accessibility. Accessibility assesses the likelihood that the author of the later text had access to the proposed model.
2, analogy determines if other authors target the same mimetic model.
3, density of similarities. The more parallels one can posit between two texts, the stronger the case that they issue from a strategic connection.
4, order of similarities examines the relative sequencing of the parallels. If they appear in the same order, the case strengthens for mimesis.
5, a distinctive trait is anything unusual in the targeted model and the proposed borrower that flags a literary relationship.
6, interpretability asks what might be gained by viewing one text as a debtor to another.
And finally, parallels satisfy the criterion of ancient recognition when one can show that readers within the culture recognized the imitation. Now, my only goal in this podcast is to apply these criteria to one narrative that appears in all 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's the exorcism of the Gerasene demoniac as an imitation of Homer's stories of Polyphemus and Circe. So, accessibility. Was the Odyssey available to the synoptic evangelists? Listen to the words of a Greek elite, a contemporary of Mark, that Richard is going to read. Richard, Homeric epics.
Yeah, Homer's epics are our baby clothes, and we nourish our minds by draughts of its milk. He stands at our side as we each grow up and share our youth as we gradually come to manhood. When we are mature, his presence within us is at its prime, and even in old age, we never weary of him. When we stop, we thirst to begin him again. In a word, the only end of Homer for human beings is the end of life.
Now, obviously that's hyperbolic, but it gives expression to what this author thinks the importance of Homer is in Greek identity. According to Dio-Chrysostom, yet another Markan contemporary, quote, Homer is the first, middle, and last of Greek culture. If a Greek reader in the early Roman Empire owned a book, it likely was one or more scrolls of Homer's 24. Now, do you have anything to add to that, of the importance of the accessibility of the Homeric epics in the Roman Empire?
Well, yeah, I think we could also, even by degree, talk about its canonicity, how sacred these texts were in the cultural mind of the time,
Right.
and how saturated the culture was with this and permeated. I think, if anything, we have to, I think, assume that most any convert to the religion in the Mediterranean world would have had some degree of familiarity with these stories.
One statistic I love to draw out is in fragments of papyri that we have from Egypt, from 200 BCE to 200 CE, we have 600 fragments of Homer. We have 5 of the Septuagint. Now, if people are reading something, they're not reading the Septuagint. They're more likely educated with Homer. And Homer was the core of ancient education. One of the first lines that students learned to write was, Homer was not a man, but a god. So I think we're okay with accessibility.
Well, there's another side to this. The accessibility of modern interpreters, I think, is more the problem here. It's not that the ancient people, any given convert would probably know more about the epics than any given New Testament scholar today.
No, absolutely. That's a very good point.
Right.
Hegel once said, Homer was the oxygen Greeks breathed. But it's not the oxygen the biblical scholars breathe.
Right.
And so it's foreign. The second criterion is analogy. Did other authors target Homer's stories of Polyphemus and Circe? Virgil's Polyphemus and Circe in the Aeneid is a good example. Virgil wanted to make Aeneas more compassionate than Odysseus. And to do so, he has his own story, Aeneas going to Polyphemus's island, and Odysseus, or Ulysses for Virgil, abandoned one of his own men on the island to certain doom. Aeneas goes to the island, sees the monster, and rescues this Greek, his enemy, and takes him aboard ship to show that Aeneas is more compassionate than his Ulysses. And he also has a passage about Circe, but Aeneas is wise enough to avoid her island, even though he can hear the men howling and squealing like pigs. So yes, Virgil, the Odyssey here. And notice the syncresis, that is, there's a comparison that makes Aeneas more compassionate than Ulysses, and that's what why Virgil is writing this. But Lucian, writing the second half of the 2nd century, and who is a satirist, wrote a beautiful satire called True History, and you're familiar with this famous work. And writes the introduction. He acknowledges how many people have imitated the Homeric stories. And if you don't mind, please read and by the way, Lucian knows the Gospels. He knows some of them. So he may, in fact, have the Gospels in mind in this paragraph, although he doesn't say so. But if you'd read the paragraph, everything in my story.
Yes, everything in my story is a more or less comical parody of one or another of the poets, historians, and philosophers of old, who have written much that smacks of miracles and fables. Their guide and instructor in this sort of buffoonery is Homer's Odyssey, or Odysseus, who tells Alcinous and his court about winds in bondage, one-eyed men, cannibals, and savages, also about transformations of his comrades with drugs. But my lying is far more honest than theirs, and though I tell the truth in nothing else, I shall at least be truthful in saying that I am lying.
Now notice the winds of bondage is the story of Aeolus, who gives Odysseus a bag of winds, and that gets imitated in the Stilling of the Storm story.
Right.
Who does he have in mind with one-eyed men?
Right.
Cyclopes, cannibals and savages. And who does he have in mind when he talks about transformations of comrades with drugs?
Right.
Circe. And you have parallels to these things in the Gospel of Mark. So don't tell me there are no analogies to this story. Well, one of my favorites is in a Christian apocryphal text, the Acts of Andrew. And we can talk about that later, but it clearly is an imitation of the Circe story, including the giving of drugs, turning prisoners into swine, and Andrew plays the role of Odysseus and frees his men. You have any comments about analogy?
Yeah, I just think this quote is wonderful. I'm a big fan of Lucian, and so it's fun to even read him. Even in this meeting now, this is a great quote, and I want to take this away. But I would just say that even with my own methodologies, the work that's done, for instance, it may not even be textual, more cultural mimesis in this sense, but the idea that the divine birth myth with Alexander and with Matthew's divine birth myth, what's that mean in terms of transvaluing? What kind of king is this vis-a-vis Alexander the Great? What's being said there? And so you've got this connection. It's invoking these powerful images that were part of the psyche of the ancient mind in order to immediately invoke a vivid sort of set of images and symbols that would then convey this artistic representation expedite that in some ways by drawing on already formed significant notions in the mind.
Well, I think that's helpful, and I'll tell you why. Even though you may not formalize it that way, you have your own commitments to accessibility and analogy. Mm-hmm. That is, was the Alexander myth known? Was it available to Matthew, let's say?
Right.
And of course it was. And then you also have the issue of analogy. Are other people evoking the memory of Alexander the Great in order to talk about their leaders? And there's no doubt about that one either. And so then the question is, how many similarities can you line up between, let's say, Matthew's infancy narrative and the Alexander tradition? And so that the methodologies, to that extent, are coherent with each other.
That's right. Even a second one that we won't unpack here, but that touches even closer to my own work, is with Romulus. And you've got, Jesus has more eyewitnesses. He has more road encounters. He has, he's shining even more than Romulus, and so there's this transvaluation. It's almost the competitive aspects of that as well.
And we're going to get to that, the issue of interpretability.
Right.
But there again with Romulus, was the Romulus legend available?
Right.
Were other people appealing to the Romulus image in order to support the glorification of emperors? Duh.
Right.
So, you've got this analogy going, and the use of it is sometimes sympathetic to say that the emperors are like Romulus. In some cases, they're agonistic to show that, in fact, in this case, Jesus is superior to Romulus.
Right. You could even shift it from accessibility to the idea that they're targeting cultural capital.
That's right, yeah.
That's right.
And I think that's what's going on with Mimesis too. But the cultural capital is expressed in literature, not simply the general culture.
That's right.
So I don't mean but I think the patterns are similar. So we have three more criteria to analyze related to the Polyphemus story. Density of similarities. The more parallels one can posit between two texts, the stronger the case that the issue from a strategic connection.
Order of similarities examines the relative sequencing of the parallels. If they appear in the same order, the case strengthens for mimesis.
A distinctive trait is anything unusual in the targeted model and the proposed borrower that flags a literary relationship. I'm going to ask us to look at my most recent book, which is Must the Synoptics Remain a Problem? This is on page 76 of the book, and we have parallel columns with the Odyssey on the left-hand column and Mark's story of the Gerasene demoniac on the right. And I'll read the Odyssey column, and you can read the Markan one. Now, we both need to remind ourselves that the reason we're doing this is we're interested in the density of parallels, the sequence of parallels, and the unusual nature of the parallels as a part of this discipline to understand mimesis. Odysseus and his crew sailed to the island of the Cyclopes and of Circe.
Jesus and his disciples sailed to the region of the Gerasenes.
On the mountains of the Cyclopes, innumerable goats grazed, and Circe turned soldiers into swine.
On the mountain, a large herd of swine grazed.
Odysseus and his crew disembarked.
Jesus and his disciples disembarked.
They encountered a savage, lawless giant who lived in a cave.
They encountered a savage, lawless demoniac who lived among the caves.
Polyphemus usually was depicted nude in art.
The demoniac was nude.
Circe recognized Odysseus and asked him not to harm her. Odysseus said, "Swear me an oath not to plan another plot to hurt me." And the giant, Polyphemus, asked Odysseus if Odysseus intended to harm him.
The demoniac recognized Jesus and asked him not to harm him. "I adjure you, by God, do not torment me."
The giant asked Odysseus his name.
Jesus asked the demoniac his name.
Odysseus answered, "Nobody is my name."
The demoniac answered, "Legion is my name."
And notice, Richard, the similarity in the Greek. Utes amoti anima, legion anima me. Odysseus subdued the giant with violence and trickery. Circe's magic turned Odysseus' soldiers into swine.
Jesus subdued about 2,000 demons with divine power and sent them into the swine, and they drove the swine into the lake.
Polyphemus the shepherd called out to his neighbors.
The swineherds called on their neighbors.
The Cyclopes came to the site asking about Polyphemus's stolen sheep.
The Gerasenes came to the site to find out about their swine.
Odysseus and crew embarked.
Jesus and his disciples embarked.
Odysseus told the giant to proclaim that he had blinded him.
Jesus told the healed demoniac, proclaim what God had done for him.
The giant asked Odysseus, now aboard ship, to come back.
The demoniac asked Jesus, now aboard the ship, if he would be with him.
Odysseus refused the request.
Jesus refused the request.
Odysseus and his crew sailed away.
Jesus and his disciples sailed away.
Odysseus awoke during a tempest in the episode immediately following the story of the Cyclopes.
Jesus awoke during a tempest and calmed the wind and the sea just before the exorcising the demoniac.
Don't close the page quite yet, because we're going to look at page 77 in a minute. What do you think? Do you think these parallels are dense, sequential, and unusual?
I would say so. It's difficult. How do you get out of this is kind of what was going on in my mind. Like, this is, it's just too much. Even if you just had maybe 2 or 3 of these, I think that would be enough to tip off a reader that had any familiarity with the 2 stories.
Do you know of any commentary on Mark that talks about the Odyssey in this case?
No, it's completely absent from New Testament studies.
How could that be? That is got to be ignorance about the Hellenistic world and ancient rhetoric. I mean, how could it be absent from any discussion of this story prior to what Mimesis criticism is trying to do?
I think there's a number of things. We've talked about this at length. I don't think there's a whole lot of people that have even read the Odyssey front to back.
Right, yeah.
In New Testament studies, you could probably count them on one hand. I wouldn't be surprised. The other, it's an upsetting idea, I think, in some ways. How do people enter this field? They don't enter it to deconstruct and to find all of the literary parallels that this is a scary project in some ways, I think. What's the conclusion then if you start saying that these stories are crafted after another work that we know is fictive in its character. What does that mean then for the whole theological project that's gone on in Western
Well, I think that's a
civilization?
huge issue.
Right.
I agree with you. But my answer to it is, you don't understand what the story has done unless you see it
Yes.
as an alternative. And that goes to the next point in Mimesis criticism, interpretability. Virgil wants to rewrite the story in order to show Aeneas is more compassionate than Odysseus, Ulysses. Mark is trying to do this to show that Jesus is more compassionate than Odysseus too. Instead of blinding him and stealing his sheep, he turns the Gerasene demoniac into sane man and clothed. So the story is about this transformation of characters. So that's the interpretability of the story. By the way, it's fascinating to me that Matthew retells the story and removes almost all of the telltale traits that are unusual in its stories. It's not one demoniac, but two. Jesus does not sail to the place or from it. There's no disembarking or re-embarking. There's no exchange of names. There's no asking about the names, which is an unusual trait. There's no request of the demoniac to come with Jesus, who's already on board ship. So in my view, what Matthew has tried to do, intentionally or not, is to remove the most telling elements of the story that make it a mythos, a myth, to make it into a bios, so that here we have a shift of a myth to history. And I think the genre commitment of Matthew, that's informed biblical scholarship, that the Gospels are biographies of some kind, myths of origin.
Yeah, I think that it may go back to some of the research that Robyn Faith Walsh has done, some of her excellent work on the sophistication, the degrees of sophistication of some of these authors. It could be, oftentimes we're seeing Mark as inchoate and as kind of the first seed or inception of the gospel tradition. I think it's lost on a lot of people just how creative that work was, because
Exactly.
It wasn't using all of these prior gospel texts in order to craft itself in so many ways. But this also suggests that Mark had a degree of literary sophistication that may have been lost on Matthew, and to some extent, or maybe Matthew didn't feel as skilled in that space, and so decided to conduct a different kind of project with that material.
Well, the Markan evangelist was brilliant and creative. I want to go back to the very first line in the Gospel of Mark. The first word in the Gospel of Mark is the word archi, and it's the origin or beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. Now, you could say that archi means it's the beginning of the book. I don't think it is. I think it's declaring what the genre is. I'm writing an archi. I'm writing an origin book. Mm-hmm. And it's the origin of this good news that we have of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. So I think the genre of Mark can be understood as a mythos of arche. It's a myth of origins. And the arche refers not to the beginning of the gospel, not to the beginning of Jesus' life. It is a declaration that the book as a whole is an arche. That's, in fact, I think what the original title of the book was. It wasn't attributed to Mark. It is an arche of this good news. And I think that really changes the way we understand Mark. Yeah, he's very sophisticated.
Yeah, I think that's wonderfully insightful. It's interesting how much you and I agree. I studied under you and so forth, but independently, I've drawn much the same conclusion. I think that when you're dealing with an etiological myth, a kind of a charter myth, foundation myth for this cult, Mark sees that as his project. If you add the last segment on that first verse, a son of a god, you're dealing with a demigod myth at that point. I mean, right from the beginning, he tells you right up front, he shows you his cards where this is going. And so, yeah, I think it's a charter myth for the cult. It's almost whimsical in the sense that the freedom, the literary compositional freedom that Mark seems to enjoy throughout the text. And I think that's correct. I think that he's setting what would you call it, an idea, a foundation myth.
Yes, okay. Used charter myth. I would also talk about founding myth. Could be also etiological in that sense. Now, I want to ask you some questions, and I know you know the answer to. Would you say that Virgil's Aeneid is a founding myth for the early Roman Empire?
Absolutely. That's the whole point of it.
That's the whole point of it.
Right.
Is he the only one who's creating founding myth? Do you think Jews are doing so too?
Right.
Exactly. The notion that Mark is doing so, is everything in Virgil's Aeneid historical?
No, certainly not.
Certainly not. And so we give him a pass on that, but we don't give Mark a pass on the miracles in his founding myth.
Right. I think we hold, it's funny because I think in religious studies generally, we give almost any other religion a pass. We almost expect any other ancient major sage or founding figure to be decorated with myth and fable and folk tales and so forth from the beginning. For some reason, I think it has to do with the dogmatism and faith-motivated influence that's exerted on this field.
I have an expression that I don't know that you've heard me give, but I have given it in class and so on. The embarrassment of commensality. If somebody does your thing, it's an embarrassment that they do your thing, because then you're not special. So there's an embarrassment to commensality, and you face that all the time in people who are questioning your work, because they don't want the translation fable to be commensurable what we find in the New Testament.
It may even be reduced down to an arrogance in Western civilization that we see our myths as somehow superior to those of other cultures and civilizations.
And part of it, I think, is related to social identity theory, because people who hold to these stories understand that to be what is distinctive about their social identity, what I would call an axiological collective. That, don't worry about that. That's a sociological lingo, but it means that they're held together by ideologies. And if other people share your ideologies, it diminishes the social identity that you have, because no longer have your boundary that's different, let's say, from Judaism or Islam or whatever.
Right. The uniqueness of claims.
That's it. That's right. Yeah. I don't want to leave the story of the Gerasene demoniac quite yet. The last criterion that we have, mimesis criticism, is ancient recognition. And if you look on the next page where we've been looking, you'll see some poetry. It's at the top of the page where you have the Homeric centones. These are as early as the late 4th century. And when these poets retell the story of the Gerasene demoniac, they use lines in sequence from the story in Homer of the Gerasene demoniac. These poets saw the similarities. Let me read them. They're a little tricky to read, but I'll let you read the one after the first batch. So this is how these Byzantine Christians retold the story in poetry of the Gerasene demoniac. When they, that is Jesus and his disciples, arrived at the area located among the Gerasenes, here there was a headland where a cave lay next to the sea. That's almost identical to the Odyssey, with cascading laurel as though encircling it. In it swine and goats rested at night, and round it a high tomb was built, with large stones set deep in the earth, with tall pines and high-foliaged oaks. Here slept a monstrous man whom a demon shepherded by himself far away. He did not engage with others, but lived apart and knew only cruel thoughts. For he had been made into a monstrosity, and was not like a man who eats bread, but like a wooded peak, of high mountains that looms larger than the rest. And Richard, you can see in the left-hand column that those lines, the same sequence, absolutely the same order, with a few things changed, like having swine. So later in the poem, the poet switched to Odyssey 10 in the episode with Circe. So if you'd read those few lines.
So he, Jesus, spoke, and they, the demons, cried out and called to him, as you commanded, into the crowd of swine.
So here we have ancient recognition of similarities in these stories by Christians in the 4th century or potentially later. It's hard to date some of these centos. And so all of the criteria, Mimesis criticism, get satisfied. The story of Polyphemus is accessible, other people are imitating it. The parallels are dense, sequential, distinctive. They're interpretable. Jesus is cooler than Odysseus. And ancient Christians saw these similarities and were not embarrassed by using poetry from Homer to tell the gospel story. Now, I don't know how you can wiggle out of that constellation of considerations. And once you grant this, it opens the door to other possible imitations. And again, you won't find this in scholarship. And we both of us get blackballed of what we're doing. And I would be surprised if it could be otherwise.
Right. No, I think if you taken together, the argument is unassailable. I have yet to read a compelling criticism of your core arguments from anyone. And there's been a number of attempts, I think.
Yeah, there have been.
I think we could chalk that up to just how upsetting, disrupting your work is in this regard. But when you get down to the actual evidence here, I don't see how you wiggle out of it. I really just don't. It's that firm. And especially when you start looking at just how important Homer was in the ancient mind, it's for lack of trying almost that we're not making these kinds of investigations in the field.
Yeah, I think it's conscious avoidance, and I think there are reasons for the avoidance. By the way, we both want to thank MythVision and Derek Lambert for bringing us together to talk about this.
Certainly. It's funny, yesterday I spoke with Derek and we said this was a conclusion that we drew, that if we could take all of New Testament scholars, at least the halfway honest ones, send them all to a summer camp to study Homer. just what a fountain of great results would probably come out of that.
What fun that would be. What fun. Now,
Right.
I want to say one more thing, and this is more speculative, and you may not agree with it, but there are reasons to think that the Gerasene demoniac story also was influenced by Q. And nobody has seen that. So in the book where we've been reading, on the next page, the Markan demoniac surely imitates Homer's Polyphemus, and his Jesus imitated Circe. But here the evangelist also redacted logia from the logoi of Jesus, that is the Q document as I reconstruct it. In fact, its Beelzebub controversy may have inspired Mark's Gerasene exorcism in the first place. They went to the other side of the region of the Gerasenes, and when they disembarked from the boat, immediately a man with a defiling spirit met them in the tombs. He made his dwellings in the tombs. So if you'd read the right-hand column.
No one ever was able to bind him, for often he was bound in stocks and chains. He ripped from him the chains and smashed the stocks, and no one was strong enough to tame him.
But in the logoi of Jesus, we find this. How is anyone able to enter the house of a strong man and loot his goods unless he first binds the strong man, and then he will loot his house? It's the same Greek word that you have in Mark for binding. The Gerasene is a strong man who is possessed by the strong man. Go ahead and read the next piece for Mark and then the square that follows, and at night.
For he had said to him, defiling spirit, come out of the person.
And in the logo of Jesus, we find when the defiling spirit has come out of the person, look at the similarities, Richard, in Greek. To akatherton pneuma, exilthi apo tu anthropu, is almost exactly what you find in Mark. Okay, so then you have the business about that follows. So the next square, and the defiling spirit came out.
And the defiling spirit came out and went into the swine, and the herd rushed down the cliff into the sea, about 2,000 of them, and drowned in the sea.
Okay, and here's the parallel in the Q document. When the defiling spirit has come out of the person, again, look, Richard, at the Greek. It's almost identical. It wanders through waterless regions looking for a resting place and finds none. The reason you find none is in places where there's no water, you don't have living bodies to inhabit. Then it says, I'll return to my house from which I came, and on arrival, it finds it swept and tidied up. Then it goes and brings with it 7 other spirits more evil than itself, and moving in, they settle there. And the last circumstances of that person become worse than the first. In the Gerasene demoniac, it's thousands of demons return and give the trouble. And of course, the name Legion means cipher for the Roman legion that destroyed Jerusalem. In an ironic way, and this is the burden of this book on the synoptic problem, if you recognize what Mark has done with Homer, it makes the parallels with Q even clearer. So because you can kind of scrub the Homeric stuff out of Mark's narrative, and what do you find left? You find this stuff from Mark. Nobody has suggested that either. And so that's why we need to have a rethink of Q, because Mark is a major witness to Q. Not only did Mark know Q, he's probably the most important witness we have to Q. And so that is a heresy for people for the 2-document hypothesis.
I think this also, just kind of zooming out a little bit and looking at the larger ramifications of this, we see creativity, myth-making in the earliest strata of the gospel tradition. And I think that also debunks a common myth that we have sort of this historical core or something quasi-historical at the beginning, and then caked onto an embellishment, kind of like a fish story or something like this. But I've been saying for quite a while now that I think this was a myth factory from the beginning. And so I think the earliest strata that we have, I even went to the so-called creed in 1 Corinthians 15 about him dying on behalf of sins and raising from the dead and having appearances. Clearly myths. These are not the kind of mundane kind of fact-telling that normal people would give.
That's right. It's not folklore.
Right.
There's a wordplay that I have in Greek that it doesn't translate into English very well. The Greek word for tradition is paradosis, and the Greek word for a source of a document is a prototypos, a prototype. And so for these stories, my pun is, there's no paradosis. There's only a prototypos.
Okay.
There's not a tradition, there's a source document that gets remythologized or imitated. I'm so glad we were able to get into the Q piece, because it's a story that I think is a mimesis of Homer and a metaphrasis of Q, that is a redaction of Q that uses these elements in the narrative.
I have enjoyed your work for quite a long time. I kind of liken it to a treasure chest. Every time I go and read something in there, I always come away with treasure. And even in this conversation I have as well. And I think it's important for us, if we want to be honest in this field and intellectually honest, I think that's our moral duty.
I do too.
And I also think that it's exciting for those that are willing to see it, those that are able to investigate these kinds of things with an honest pair of glasses on. Then I think what we find is a fascinating journey into the depths and origins of this religion that, to me, is so much more exciting than what is traditionally gone on.
That is so important, Richard. This is fun. This is fun, and it captures your imagination. It has to be disciplined imagination, as we talked about from the beginning. But I feel sorry for people who are in our field who aren't given the opportunity to be imaginative in that way and to be creative. It's a real pity. And I'm grateful that Derek Lambert shares our enthusiasm and our joy for this. And maybe this is a good way to stop the conversation, but what else would you want to say, Richard?
Yeah, I do think it's creative, but I also want to just drive home that this is solid, inescapable argumentation that we're finding parallels here in the Logoi of Jesus, and there is some measure of speculation that's inherent to that, right?
That's right.
But at the same time, though, we're not seeing ghosts here. We're, especially with this example that you've brought forward with the demoniac, I would challenge our viewers, you New Testament folks that are out there, tell us where we're wrong. What have we done wrong here? How do you get out of that? And if we're not wrong, then time for everybody to come aboard and start thinking and reasoning through this depth of literature that is impactful at every level, beginnings of this religion. And so,
Beautiful.
yeah.